Hey guys, it's Courtney and I am here with a video for Scrapping for Less. Today we're going to be using the Fawn's Holiday Helper stamp set. We're going to be creating a background with the smaller stamps within the set, and I'm using my acrylic block here. I'm not using a stamp positioner. The best way to do this, I find, if you have a ton of tiny little images, is I'm taking my T-square ruler here, and this is a panel of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I'm just drawing very light pencil lines right down the center vertically and horizontally to basically get 4 equal size rectangles here. And then I'll just take my little tiny stamps and position them in just one of those rectangles. So I'm just using the top left-hand corner one here, taking out all of the images that I want to include in my background, kind of placing those around the way I want them. And you may have to play around with this, and you don't necessarily need to fill in the entire area. We can fill in any gaps later on with those little itty bitty tiny ones. These are just mainly the ones that I'm going to be coloring. Once I was happy with the placement of all of my little stamps here, I picked them all up on an acrylic block all together in that same position as I had placed them down on my card panel. And I'm going to be using a Copic safe ink here, and I'm going to follow my pencil lines, and I'm going to stamp that right down where we positioned them onto the card panel, then ink up my stamps again and stamp them in each of those little rectangles that we had drawn out with our pencil. Now, once I had all of my images stamped, I did go ahead and erase all of my pencil lines. Even though we're more than likely not going to be coloring right over the pencil lines, anytime you're using alcohol inks or a lot of different mediums, once you color over the pencil lines, you're not going to be able to erase them. So anytime you use that pencil, just make sure that you erase it before you start your coloring. I also took one of the snowflakes in the stamp set and stamped that around in some of those areas that we maybe had gaps, and this is one of the snowflakes that you can actually color in. There's some solid ones in there too that we will use later on. Next, we'll move on to the Copic coloring, and I kept this super simple. Everything I colored was either 1 or 2 color blends. So I'm starting off with this little spool of ribbon. I'm laying out my lightest color, covering up the entire area. Then I'll go in with my darkest color, just add a little bit of shading on either side. This is a round object, so you want to make sure that you keep your highlight right there in the center. And then going back in with my lightest color to blend that out. Now these are really tiny, really, really tiny. So you could get away with just 1 color. Most of the time I did use 2, but you'll still see that you can get a contrast, enough contrast with just the 2 colors. For this little candy cane, I'm not doing any shading. I'm just filling in every other stripe there with my darkest red. Next, we'll move on to our greens, and I'm going to color my little scissors here, just the handles with the green, covering up the entire area with my lightest color, and I'm just adding a little tiny bit of my darkest color, kind of where the handles meet. And I'm really barely touching the paper here, being this area is so tiny. Then I'll go in with my lightest color and just blend that area out a little bit. Next, we'll move on to our next color combination, and I'm going to be coloring these rolls of wrapping paper. So I'm starting off with my lightest color once again, basically leaving a highlight right there in the center, flicking out from underneath where the actual roll is, I guess, and just adding 2 little straight lines on top of the roll, being this is a rounder object. Going in with my darkest color, going right over those flicks that we had created with our lightest color, including those 2 little skinny lines on the roll of wrapping paper, then going back in with my lightest color and blending all of those areas out. Now, there are those tiny little stamps that we'll use later on. You can certainly stamp these right on top of the wrapping paper to give it like a pattern, but we're going to go in with our white gel pen later. There's going to be plenty of areas that we need to fix where I kind of went out of the lines because these are so tiny, but we're also going to be adding a little bit of interest and design to some of these objects as well. Next, we'll move on to these little tape dispensers, I guess, and we're going to use the same 2 color greens. I didn't switch up my color combinations at all. I used the same color combinations throughout the entire panel. I'm just putting a little bit of shading on either side of this little tape dispenser, then going in with my lightest color and blending that out just a little bit. Now for this little nice list, I think it is, I want this to appear white. So I'm going to go in with my cool grays. I'm starting with my darkest color, which is the C3, just adding a little bit of shading on the top and the bottom, and where it kind of is bent over and under, I'm adding a little bit of shading there. Then I'll go in with my C1, which is almost white, and blending that out to the center, leaving the center white. So I'm not extending my flicks all the way. I am leaving just a little bit of white there in the center of this little list. I'm also going to take my C1 and add a little bit of color to the wrapping paper, the end of the wrapping paper. I'll add a little tiny bit of shading to the blades of the scissors. Again, super tiny area. You can totally avoid doing any kind of shading here. Nobody's ever going to notice. I'll also add some C1 to the little spool of ribbon, I guess where the cardboard part of it would be. For my little teddy bears here, I'm going to use my E31 and E33. My shading here would be underneath his little face and behind his little feet because he's in a sitting position, and I just put a little bit of a shadow around his face on either side, going in with my E33, going over those same areas that I mapped out with my lightest color, then going back with my E31 and blending all of that out. Now there were several areas that I kind of went out of the lines, or maybe my colors bled a little bit. Not only are these tiny images, but I tend to be a little bit messy sometimes. So I did go in with my colorless blender and fix up some of those areas. And I also took my white gel pen for the darker colors, like the red. I'll use my colorless blender just to fix those areas up. You're better off using a white gel pen for the red rather than the colorless blender. It's just going to spread out that color. While I had my white gel pen out, I decided to add a few little details here and there. I am going to be adding some polka dots to the ribbon to make that look like patterned, I guess. And these are really tiny, so I'm just basically tapping down my little white gel pen there. Not any specific pattern, just dots here and there. Also for the wrapping paper, I decided to add some stripes to this. Again, with my white gel pen, these do not have to be perfect. My lines were not perfectly spaced or centered or whatever, but you're not going to tell the difference once everything is done. Now for these little snowflakes, these are not a solid image, and I didn't want to leave them white. I was initially going to leave them white, but I ended up bringing in my B00 and just coloring these in solid just to give them a little bit of color. And once all of my coloring was finally complete, we're going to go in and fill in some of these gaps to make it a little bit more full and more like pattern paper. I'm going to take some colored ink here. These are both by Hero Arts. And I'm taking some of the really tiny fill-in stamps here, I call them, and just kind of scattering them throughout. I'm using the red for the heart. I'll use the green for the star, and then I'll bring in, I think it's called pumpkin pie. It's kind of like a golden yellow or golden orange for the little star. And again, just there's really no rhyme or reason for this. I'm just kind of scattering them throughout to fill in some of my empty spaces. Once I was happy with the placement of all of my stamping and coloring, I was going to leave this as is, but I decided to take a stitched rectangle die, and I went ahead and placed this, centered this as the best I could. Stuck this down with some Post-it note tape and ran this through my die cutting machine. And I was going to initially use that frame, but realized that that wasn't centered at all. So I ended up taking a piece of red cardstock, just cut down to slightly larger than my panel itself, adhered this with my Tombow Mono multi-glue flat onto the red panel, and then adhering the entire thing onto a top folding A2 size note card. Once I had all of those panels adhered to my card base, I wanted to add quite a bit of shimmer to my background here. So I'm taking a Nouveau Glimmer pen or glitter pen, and I'm adding shimmer to pretty much everything here. The wrapping paper, the ribbon, the nice list, everything I can think of. You can't really tell on camera, but there is a ton of shimmer on here. Now I wanted to kind of get a little bit more red. When I think of Christmas, I think of red, and there just wasn't enough there for me. So I'm going to be adding my sentiment with some more of that red cardstock that we used for the mat. And I'm going to white heat emboss this. So there's quite a few sentiments in the stamp set that you can kind of piece together. So I'm just taking out 3 here that will go well together. Taking my red cardstock here, treating this with my anti-static tool. I'll be using white embossing powder here. Whenever you emboss, you're going to want to use an anti-static tool, but especially when you're using darker cardstock or brighter cardstock, any straight white embossing powder is going to show. So that anti-static tool is very inexpensive and definitely worth having. So I lined up my little sentiments here, stamped them with Versamark ink, and I'm going to be using Hero Art's white embossing powder to heat set this. Once I did have all of that heat set, I took out my paper trimmer and just cut these down into strips. You can certainly do this with scissors, but I find it hard to cut a straight line sometimes. So it's just easier for me to do both ends with my paper trimmer. I will take my Scotch foam tape and pop these up onto my card panel. I kind of lay, before I press down on my foam tape there, I just make sure everything is lined up perfectly. You can kind of move them around even after you have the foam tape down, as long as you don't press down too hard. So once I had everything down and happy with the placement, I did stick those down permanently, and that is it for today's card, guys. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.